The rider came through the valley just as the light was changing. It wasn't dusk yet, but the sun had started to dip, throwing long shadows off the hills that folded like worn linens around the basin. Dust clung to the cuffs of his trousers and the folds of his coat, and his gelding moved with the kind of patience that spoke to miles already traveled. He didn't look left or right, didn't stop to take in the crags or the cottonwoods or the faint breath of water coming from somewhere below the ridge. He was just passing through. That's what he told himself. He rode past a broken fence line, rails gray and weather-split, and further down, past a wind-blown clothesline where a single flannel shirt twisted in the air like a ghost waiting to be noticed. Then he saw the house. It was small, timber-built, and sun-aged, with a chimney puffing a thin, reluctant smoke. Chickens scratched in the hard-packed dirt, and a mule stood tied under a mesquite, swishing flies with its tail. No sound carried but the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the occasional clink of tack. He wasn't planning to stop. But she stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on the hem of her skirt, and something in the way she moved made him draw rein without thinking. She wasn't old, maybe just past 30, and her hair was pulled back in a braid that had come loose with the wind. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at him like she saw something behind his eyes and was trying to decide what kind of man he was. "You hungry?" she asked. He took a moment, touched the brim of his hat, just passing through. "Still," she said, and turned toward the door, her voice neither coaxing nor cold. "Supper, on." He didn't know why he swung down. Habit maybe, or the pull of warmth that slipped from behind the screen door, the smell of bread and something stewing with onion and salt. He led the horse to the hitch and tied him off, fingers moving slow, reluctant. Inside, the house was dim but clean. A fire burned low in the iron stove and cast orange light across the wooden floor. There were signs of a child, a pair of boots by the hearth too small for a grown foot, a tin cup on the table painted with bluebells. She poured water from a pitcher and handed him a clean cup without asking his name. He watched her ladle stew into bowls, her movements practiced but not hurried, as though she'd done it 1,000 times with no one to talk to while she did. When she finally sat across from him, her face was calm. Not soft exactly, but settled, like someone who'd long ago stopped waiting for things to be easy. "You got far to go?" she asked after a while. He chewed, swallowed. "Far enough." "That's so." He glanced to the side at the mantel above the hearth. A photograph in a simple frame, two people, young and unsmiling. The man in the picture looked like the kind who'd leave a mark if he raised his hand, the kind who didn't come back once he left. "You live here alone." She didn't answer right away, just looked at her bowl. "My boy's asleep already. He's 5. House is quieter when he's down." He nodded, not sure what to say to that. They ate in silence for a time, the quiet not quite comfortable but not unfriendly either. Outside, a coyote barked once, sharp and distant. She didn't flinch. He watched her fingers, calloused and strong, cradling the rim of her bowl like it was something precious. "You mind me asking what you're riding for?" she said. "Don't rightly know, just keep moving." She looked at him then, not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something like recognition. "You're welcome to rest your horse in the barn," she said, standing, lifting her bowl. "Ain't much, but it's dry." He hesitated, then nodded, rose from the table, and followed her out into the cooling dark. The barn smelled of hay and old sweat, the comforting stink of animal life and wood rubbed smooth by years of use. She handed him a lantern and pointed to a stall. He bedded his gelding down and brushed the dust from its flanks, aware of her footsteps retreating toward the house. He could have left then, should have. But when he stepped back into the yard, the night air thick with sage and the hush of coming sleep, he looked at the light in the kitchen window and didn't move. Something about her voice, something about the way she hadn't asked for anything. She just asked him to stay for supper. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. He took the edge of the porch steps come morning, boots in hand, socks damp with the sweat of uneasy sleep. The barn had held the night off well enough, but rest don't always mean peace, and his dreams had been cluttered with things he thought he'd outrun. Gunsmoke, river water, a boy's cry echoing off canyon walls. The sun was coming up slow behind the ridge, sky bleeding, that soft wash of orange and lavender that made everything look like it was breathing. He sat and pulled his boots on, slow and deliberate. No reason to rush. The screen door creaked and she stepped out, mug in one hand, her braid tighter today. She wore a shawl draped over her shoulders and her eyes were sharp, already watching the horizon like she had to keep count of what might come out of it. "Coffee's hot," she said. He nodded his thanks, stood, and followed her inside. The boy was at the table, swinging his legs and whispering to a rag-stuffed horse with one button eye. He looked up shy, then hid his face behind the toy. The man offered a half-smile and a quiet "mornin'." The boy didn't answer, just peeked at him again through a curtain of uncombed hair. They ate cornbread and eggs without talking much. The woman asked no questions, but her gaze rested on him now and then, not prying, just keeping record. She seemed like the type who noticed more than she said. The kind of woman who'd learned early to keep her mouth shut and her ears open. "I've got fence to mend," she said after clearing the plates. "If you're still set on leaving, the road's west, past the Cottonwood Bend." He chewed that over, thumb grazing the rim of his cup. "I could lend a hand before I go." She met his eyes then, steady and sure. "Don't owe me nothin', mister." "Didn't say I did." She watched him another second, then gave the smallest nod. "Reckon I could use the help." Out in the field the sun was higher, warm enough to bake sweat into their shirts. They worked in rhythm, her hands confident with wire and hammer, his strength filling in where she faltered with the weight. She didn't talk much, and neither did he, but every so often their eyes met across the line, and something unspoken passed between them like a shared breath. The boy wandered close once, clutching the toy horse, then closer still, until he stood near the man's knee. He didn't speak, just watched the way calloused fingers twisted metal and tied knots with quiet precision. "That's a strong horse you've got," the boy said at last. The man looked down. "He is." "What's his name?" "Don't rightly call him anything. Never needed to." The boy frowned like that didn't sit right. He should have a name. Things deserve names. "Maybe you can give him one," the man said after a pause. The boy nodded, solemn as a judge. "I'll think on it." The woman looked over from her end of the fence, but didn't say a word. Just watched the two of them like it stirred something in her she hadn't let rise in years. By sundown, the fence was mostly patched. He stretched his back and looked out across the land, hard country, but with a kind of fragile grace if you squinted through the dust. She stood beside him, arms crossed, quiet. "Been 3 years since I had help out here," she said. "Since before." She didn't finish, and he didn't ask. "I'll put on supper," she added. "You're welcome again." He could have said no, could have mounted up and followed the west road like he meant to all along, but instead he said, "All right." Inside, the boy was drawing in the dust on the floor with a stick, murmuring about horses and cowboys, and something about dragons, too. She ladled out beans this time, with salt pork and a heel of bread. It wasn't fancy, but it sat warm in his gut and filled something deeper than hunger. After she lit a lantern and sat by the window, knitting a patch into an old shirt sleeve. The boy fell asleep on the rug, mouth open, toy horse clutched tight. The man watched her in the flicker of light. Her brow furrowed slightly in concentration, and every so often she'd glance at the child, as if to be sure he hadn't disappeared. "You ever think about leavin'?" he asked. She looked up, used to, not so much anymore. "Why not?" She tied off a knot and shrugged. "Land's not much, but it's mine, and she nodded to the boy, he needs a place to root." He nodded, took that in. There was something brave in that, braver than any man riding with a gun on his hip. When she stood to take the boy to bed, she paused in the doorway, looking back. "You can take the cot tonight, better than the barn." He didn't answer, just gave a slow nod, unsure of what it meant that she was offering. When the lamp went out, he lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. He was still telling himself he'd ride on come morning. But the road didn't seem so sure anymore. The rain came down soft at first, a whisper against the roof just before dawn, then heavier, steady as breath, soaking into the hard-packed ground and filling the low places with slow silver puddles. He woke to the sound, disoriented, the thin blanket tangled around his legs and the scent of wood smoke still lingering in the air. The cot creaked beneath him as he sat up. No saddle, no hoofbeat, no east or west. just the hush of water falling on the earth like a benediction. She was already up. He could hear the scrape of wood against iron as she fed the stove, the low murmur of a kettle set to boil. No words, just the rhythm of living. He liked that about her, that she didn't fill the quiet unless she meant to. He stood, folded the blanket neat, and stepped barefoot into the kitchen. She glanced at him, nodded toward the counter where a cup already waited. "Storm'll hold a spell," she said. "Best wait it out." He took the cup, warming his hands. "Didn't plan to stay this long." "I didn't plan to invite you in," she said, and there was the faintest curl of dry humor at the corner of her mouth. He allowed himself a breath of something close to a smile. They spent the morning fixing things that didn't require dry skies. The pantry shelves were sagging under old weight, so he braced them. The door to the shed had a loose hinge. She held it steady while he hammered it tight. The boy watched from the window, chin on the sill, narrating a story about a shipwreck and a sea monster made of lightning. At midday, the rain let up enough for her to send the boy out to gather kindling under the eaves. She stood in the doorway watching him, arms folded against the chill. "He talks to himself," she said. "Always has. I used to worry it meant something, but I think it's just the quiet pressing too hard on him." "Doesn't seem lonesome," the man said. "He's learned how not to be." They were quiet a while, watching the boy jump puddles with two big boots. "You ever have any?" she asked suddenly, not looking at him. He shook his head. "No." "You wanted to." He considered, "Thought I might once, but that life ran out before it started." She didn't ask what happened, just nodded, like maybe she understood the shape of that wound without needing to see it. That night she brought out a deck of cards, edges soft and frayed with time. They played in silence, save for the crackle of fire and the boy's soft breathing in the other room. "Most folks that pass through," she said, laying down a queen, "they don't stay past supper." He didn't meet her gaze, just studied the hand he held. "Wasn't planning to." "But you're still here." He set his cards down. "Storm hasn't broken yet." She leaned back in her chair, eyes half-lidded. "Maybe it ain't just the weather." He didn't reply. Outside, the rain began again, lighter this time. The kind that slips in under doors and seeps into boots if you're not careful. He looked at her then, really looked, at the way her face had softened since that first night, how the worry that once lined her brow now seemed more like memory than present fear. "You trust me?" he asked, quiet. She didn't blink. "Not yet, but I don't feel the need to watch my back when you're near." It was more than he expected, more than he deserved. She rose then, picked up the cards, and turned toward her room. "Good night," she said. He watched the door close behind her. The cot felt different that night, like a place rather than a stopover. And in the silence that followed, he found he wasn't counting the hours till he rode out. Not anymore. The thaw came slow that spring, like the land itself had to be coaxed back to warmth. Frost clung to the northern hills even as green nudged up through the soil. Mornings were still sharp with cold, but by midday, the air turned soft, and the sky wore that pale, clean blue that only came after long months of gray. He didn't leave. Not after the rains ended, not when the road dried up, not even when a rider came through, old friend from some past life, offering work up near the Snake, decent pay, and a clean bunk. He'd listened, nodded polite, but something in him had already rooted deep. The woman never asked him to stay, not with words, but every day she handed him a task without explaining it, and every night she made enough supper for two. Some days they spoke more, others not at all. It didn't matter. What passed between them was slower than speech, trust that didn't need permission. He learned the rhythms of the place, the hen that pecked at his bootlaces, the mule that brayed like it had something to prove, the boy's laughter spilling like river water when he ran too fast downhill. And the woman, Ruth, he knew now. Her name had come quiet one afternoon while she was shelling peas, no ceremony to it, just a truth spoken plain. "Ruth." There was a night the boy woke screaming, lungs full of some nightmare that shook the walls. The man was out of bed before he knew what he was doing, crossing the house barefoot, heart thudding. Ruth was already there, arms around the child, whispering nothing words into his hair. The man stood in the doorway, not knowing if he was meant to leave or step closer. When the boy's sobs quieted, Ruth looked up. Her eyes found his in the dark. He gets them when the wind comes out of the west, same wind that took his father. She didn't explain more, he didn't ask. Later, after the boy had gone back to sleep, she came to the kitchen and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped cup, handed it to him without meeting his gaze. He wasn't kind, she said. My husband, he made this house a quiet I couldn't fill. The man held the cup, didn't drink. You don't have to tell me. I know, but I want to. So she did, not all at once and not with self-pity, just the facts. How her husband's anger came in storms. How she learned to steer clear, then how she learned to fight back. How one night he didn't come home and how the silence that followed was almost worse. Almost. I buried the weight of him, she said, but the shape of it's still here, in the walls, in me. He nodded. Some ghosts don't ask to be chased off. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. She looked out into the dark. You're not like him. No, he said, but I carry my own past. Her eyes flicked to his face, searching. You ever lay it down? He looked at her a long time. Not yet. She nodded once, then turned back toward her room, leaving the door partway open. Days passed. The boy took to walking beside him when he worked, asking questions that had no easy answer. Why do clouds move? How do you tell when someone's lying? What's the difference between alone and lonely? The man answered when he could. When he couldn't, he listened. One afternoon, Ruth asked if he'd help fix the roof before summer came. They worked together, shoulders brushing, laughter slipping through like cracks in the clouds. She didn't flinch when he touched her arm to steady her on the ladder. He didn't pull away when her fingers brushed his as they passed tools. He still slept on the cot. But sometimes, late at night, he'd wake to the sound of her breathing in the next room, and he'd feel a strange ache in his chest. Not want, not quite, more like longing for a thing he'd never known could last. It was in that season, with the earth turning tender again, that the boy came to him one morning and said, I think I've got a name for your horse. Oh yeah, the man said, tightening the cinch. The boy grinned. Mercy, 'cause he came when we needed him. The man paused, one hand resting on the saddle horn. He looked up at the sky, then back at the boy. Yeah, he said, that sounds right. By summer, the dust returned. It clung to everything, boot leather, windowsills, the curls at the boy's nape, and turned the air thick with memory. The man worked the land with a steady hand and a silence that had begun to feel less like guarding and more like listening. Every day, he took his meals at Ruth's table and bedded down on the cot that now carried the imprint of his rest. The lines of his face had softened, and sometimes, when the boy did something especially foolish or brave, he smiled without thinking. They fell into the shape of a life, the 3 of them, not perfect but real. Then came the man with the red scarf. He rode in just before dusk, hat low, horse lathered and restless. Ruth was in the garden, stooped among the squash, when the hoofbeats slowed near the fence. The man stepped out of the barn with a pitchfork still in hand. The rider looked hard, weathered lean. His eyes flicked from Ruth to the boy to the stranger beside the barn. Didn't expect company, the rider said. Didn't expect callers, Ruth replied. The man stepped forward, slow. You lookin' for someone? The rider's gaze narrowed. Might be. Been ridden east from the border, trailin' a man with a limp and a pale horse. Heard he was seen north of Abilene. No one spoke for a long moment. The gelding, Mercy, whickered from the corral. Ruth's hand never stopped moving, still brushing dirt from the squash leaves like nothing had shifted. But the boy had gone quiet behind her, clutching a tin pail. The stranger's eyes settled on the man. You know anything about that? The man didn't blink. Plenty of pale horses out there. The rider stared a beat longer, then spat in the dust. Suppose so. He tipped his hat toward Ruth, not unkind. Ma'am. And then he rode off, slow and deliberate, like a man trying to decide what scent to follow. That night after the boy had gone to sleep and the lantern was low, Ruth stood at the sink, staring out into the dark. You gonna tell me what that was about? He stood near the stove, hands curled at his sides. Used to ride with a man who did bad things. I stayed longer than I should have. By the time I got loose, I'd seen enough to make some folks want me buried with him. She turned, arms crossed. You run from it. I tried to make it right, took something back from him he shouldn't have had, been hunted for it since. She didn't look shocked, just tired in a way that went deep. You bring danger to my door. He met her eyes. I'd never let it touch you, or the boy. They stood there, the two of them, the air between them filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Then she spoke, voice quiet and hard as flint. I've lived with fear before. It don't rattle me. But I need to know, if trouble finds you here, will you stand or will you run? He answered without pause, I'll stand. She held his gaze another moment, then nodded once. All right. He slept outside that night under the stars, mercy tied close. Not from shame or fear, just to be sure. In the morning, the boy brought him coffee and a piece of bread. You gonna leave? The boy asked, eyes shadowed. Not if I can help it. The boy handed him the bread. Mama doesn't say much, but she listens when you talk. He looked down at the child, saw the man he might become, the scars already forming. Then I'll keep talking, he said. The days that followed were sharper, edged with tension like a storm you can smell but haven't yet seen. The man kept watch on the ridges. Ruth kept her rifle cleaned. The boy asked fewer questions and stuck close to the house. But the rhythm held, chores done, meals made, a life still lived. Because even when danger rides close, some places are worth holding ground for. The rider came back at dawn, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 men, not 4, not a posse, just enough to make a point. They didn't come fast, didn't holler or raise dust, but they came with purpose. The man saw them first, from the barn roof where he'd been mending shingles in the cool hush before sunbreak. He stood slowly, heart already settled, like he'd known this was coming all along. He didn't call out, just climbed down, fetched his rifle, and walked to the house. Ruth met him on the porch, shotgun already slung. Her braid hung heavy down her back, and there was no fear in her face, just a fierce steadiness. They mean to end it, he said. She nodded, so let's not let them. The boy was inside, crouched by the hearth, a knife in hand though he'd never had to use it for anything more than whittling sticks. The man knelt beside him. You stay in here, he said, no matter what. The boy's lip trembled. You said you'd stand. I will, but not if you're in the line of it. Ruth touched the boy's shoulder. You watch the door, that's your job. The men rode up without fanfare, boots creaking as they dismounted. The red-scarfed rider stepped forward, hands loose but not idle. His eyes swept the house, the barn, the trees, looking for exits, calculating. You could have kept riding, he said to the man, could have stayed a ghost. The man stood between him and the porch. Ghosts don't plant beans and mend roofs. You still got it, the money. It's not about the money. The rider's mouth tightened. You took something, you don't get to live peaceful after that. The man glanced back once, saw Ruth in the doorway, her shotgun resting just behind the frame, saw the boy's small face at the window. I didn't come here to hide, he said. I came here to stop running. The rider nodded, like he understood, like maybe a piece of him even respected it. But then his hand dropped. The gunfire came fast, too fast for clean thought. Smoke curled up from the porch, from the grass, from the barn wall where a bullet hit wood. The man moved like water, rifle sure in his grip. One rider fell, the others scattered to cover, but not before Ruth's shotgun barked once, loud and final. Then silence. Dust settled. The red-scarfed rider knelt, clutching a shoulder that bled heavy into the dirt. The man walked up slow, rifle lowered. You gonna finish it, the rider rasped. No, the man said. That's what we used to do. He turned away, back toward the porch, toward the boy who'd stepped out and stood stiff with fear and pride, and toward Ruth, who was breathing hard but steady, her eyes never once leaving him. They buried the dead out past the cottonwoods, said no words over them. Just worked in silence, sweat and dirt, and the smell of gunpowder still clinging to their clothes. That night the house held its breath. The boy was quiet, playing with Mercy's brush near the hearth. The man sat at the table, hand bruised from recoil, ribs sore from a fall he hadn't noticed, until hours after the shooting stopped. Ruth came in last. She didn't speak, didn't ask, just poured him a glass of water, pressed a cool rag to the back of his neck, and sat beside him. "I used to think peace was a place," she said. He looked at her. "I think now it might be a person." He didn't answer, just reached out slow and took her hand. She let him. That night he didn't sleep on the cot, and it wasn't out of pain or duty or desperation. It was because he finally understood something he'd never let himself before. Supper had been a kindness, a welcome, but staying, that had been his choice. And now it was theirs. In the quiet dark of a house that had seen too much silence, he lay beside her and listened to her breath, to the boy's soft turning in the next room, to the wind, gentle now, like it knew it no longer had a hold on him. He'd been just passing through. But he stayed. Because she asked. And because, for once, he wanted to.